Good afternoon. My name is Michael Ernst, and I will be giving today's talk. I'm currently a PhD student in Islamic art history at Temple University's Tyler School of Art and Architecture, and an MPhil candidate in Middle East and Islamic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. I also hold bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Pennsylvania in history, Middle East and Islamic Studies, and education. Today's talk is excerpted from my MPhil thesis entitled Raising the Nile, Ethnicity and Politics in the United Grand Lodge of England Masonic Lodges of British Egypt, which I will be submitting at the end of the summer. My thesis runs roughly 80 pages, so I apologize if this excerpt seems a bit disjointed. Only recently has a history of Freemasonry outside of Western Europe and the Americas been given attention by scholars, though the literature is still sparse at best. The most probable reason for this is that Freemasonry has primarily been an Anglo-American, Continental European, and Latin American endeavor, with most lodges outside of Europe located in the United States, Canada, Australia, and the nations of Latin America, where it had been intertwined with various independence movements. Therefore, interest has been focused upon these countries. In Egypt, where the first local Masonic lodge was founded in 1799, much of the history of the craft has unfortunately been lost. The year 1964 saw Freemasonry banned by President Jamal Abdel Nasser, who, advocating the popular conspiracy theories of the time, labeled the organization as a European imperialist tool and as part of a Zionist plot against his government. Much of the Masonic material from Egypt has either gone missing or been destroyed, though several boxes of documents have made their way to England, Italy, and France. Looking through the archival material located at the Library and Museum of the United Grand Lodge of England, from here on referred to as the U.G.L.E, one can piece together a picture of English Freemasonry in Egypt from its early days to its final ones. And I spent a few weeks spread over 3 years doing so. Unlike most other parts of the British Empire, where Freemasonry either successfully established itself or never took root, the craft had a strong presence in Egypt, yet it failed to attract large numbers of Egyptians as members. In this presentation, I will be looking at some of the factors that kept Freemasonry from becoming a very strong social movement within the country, something that inevitably allowed for it to be easily discredited and banned as a supposed colonialist relic. These factors, often relating to both racial tensions and politics, led to an unstable climate for Freemasonry in Egypt from the late 1890s onward. Despite the insistence of English Freemasonry on keeping politics and sectarian religious discussion out of the lodge room, Egyptian politics were inextricably intertwined with Masonry in Egypt for a number of reasons. Like the U.G.L.E and the Grand Orient of France, the craft in Egypt frequently sought out recognition from the heads of government, which often led to the organization being drawn into local politics. In addition, political and ethnic tensions among the English, French, Italian, and Egyptians often spilled over into the lodge. Disagreements about jurisdiction and regularity, that is to say, recognition by the major international Masonic bodies, was another source of contention, and seems to have been connected with ethno-political tensions. Lastly, internal disputes within the Egyptian Masonic bodies do not seem to have been as easily resolved as they were in other jurisdictions, owing to differences of the intended goals of Freemasonry in the country among the various ethnic groups. All these factors combined to form a deadly cocktail that eventually poisoned the well of Freemasonry in Egypt, preventing it from firmly establishing itself as a major social movement and leading to a widespread unfavorable opinion of the craft, ultimately resulting in its ban by President Nasser. Before discussing the topics of ethnicity and politics, I'm going to set the stage by giving a brief history of Freemasonry in Egypt. Modern Freemasonry came to Egypt with the Napoleonic invasion of 1798, when Napoleon Bonaparte attempted to conquer both Egypt and the Levant. While his efforts eventually ended in defeat, they sparked both an interest in Egypt by the Europeans, as well as an interest in Europe by the Egyptians. The first symbolic lodge of Freemasons founded in Egypt was U.G.L.E, a military lodge founded under the auspices of General Jean-Baptiste Kléber in 1799 and warranted by the Grand Orient of France. U.G.L.E, or ISIS Lodge, was eventually closed in 1801 with the French withdrawal. This was not the end of Freemasonry in the country, however. Another French lodge, Loge Pyramid Lodge, founded in 1845, was very influential in spreading the craft early on. It included prominent members such as Prince Abdul Halim Pasha of the Egyptian royal family and the Emir Abdelkader el-Jazairi, who had waged a long-running resistance movement against the French invaders of Algeria until French forces exiled him to the Levant, that is to say, the Eastern Mediterranean region. For the most part, though, French Freemasonry in Egypt peaked around 1850 and was in decline thereafter. As more of the European powers began to take an interest in Egypt and establish a presence, more permanent Masonic lodges began to be formed. A short-lived Scottish lodge under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Scotland was founded in 1860. However, English Freemasonry in Egypt dates to 1862, when a warrant was issued for St. John's Lodge, number 1221 in Alexandria. Bulwer Lodge of Cairo, number 1068, was warranted 3 years later, with Grisha Lodge, number 1105, being warranted the year after, in 1866, and Zetlin Lodge, number 1157, the year after that. These four lodges were organized into the District Grand Lodge of Egypt and formed the bulwark of Anglo-Egyptian Masonry for most of the remainder of the 19th century. French Masonry was revived in Egypt in 1864 with the formation of the Supreme Oriental Council for the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite. In 1867, the Grand Orient of Egypt was formed with a somewhat dubious warrant from the Grand Orient of Naples, but with the support of many Italian Masons. While Continental Masonry thrived, English lodges were a minority in Egypt. During the 1860s, they retained small membership rolls, though they received a boon in the royal patronage of the late Khedive Muhammad Ali's youngest son, Prince Halim, who was appointed to the office of District Grand Master and held the position for 7 years. Unfortunately, Prince Halim was expelled from the country due to accusations of his fomenting a rebellion against his nephew, the Khedive Ismail. Halim thereafter spent his exile in Constantinople and appointed the British consul in Cairo, Raphael Borg, as Deputy District Grand Master to act in his stead. When the craft began to accept Arab members, Freemasonry became an ecumenical endeavor in Egypt, with both Christian clergy and Muslim imams as members of the Masonic order. Those Egyptians attracted to Freemasonry were primarily attracted to the Enlightenment ideas of freedom and equality espoused by Masonry, especially in light of Ottoman interference in their country. Many of the Egyptians sent to France by Muhammad Ali to learn technical skills and trades were impressed by the various private organizations which were free of state control. They felt that these organizations, unfettered and allowed the freedom to pursue what they wanted, were the primary reason that the Europeans had been so successful in intellectual and technological advances. As Masonic lodges from various jurisdictions increased in number, a great want began to be felt for a national Masonic body that would unite all of the Masons in Egypt for the purpose of bettering Egyptian society. Thus, in 1876, the National Grand Lodge of Egypt was organized as the primary Masonic body for the country, with jurisdiction over the symbolic degrees. It was formed out of the Italian-controlled Grand Orient of Egypt, which then split into two bodies: the National Grand Lodge of Egypt, responsible for the 3 symbolic degrees, and the National Grand Orient of Egypt, responsible for the higher degrees of the Ancient and Accepted Scottish Rite, and also the Rite of Memphis Mizraim. The following year, in 1877, the U.G.L.E recognized the National Grand Lodge and its own District Grand Lodge of Egypt went into abeyance. Its past District Deputy Grand Master, Reëstablishment, was appointed Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge in 1879 and remained in that office until 1884. The National Grand Lodge continued to be the official recognized Masonic body in Egypt by the U.G.L.E. until it began to use the irregular Memphitic rite, that is to say the rite of Memphis Mizraim, for the 3 symbolic degrees, following the departure of Brother Borg. Because of this, the U.G.L.E. withdrew recognition and reconstituted the former District Grand Lodge in 1899 as the District Grand Lodge of Egypt and the Sudan, this time including Anglo-Egyptian Sudan in its jurisdiction. Thus, we must divide the history of English Freemasonry in Egypt into 2 periods, 1862 to 1877 and 1899 to 1964. In general, it can be said that English Freemasonry struggled during the early years of the newly reconstituted District Grand Lodge. The craft had begun to be viewed with suspicion by the Arab community due to the members from Egypt's elite that it attracted, and the internal controversies plaguing the organization in the country. The English District Grand Lodge was thus created in 1899 with only 4 member lodges: Bulwer Lodge of Cairo, Grisha Lodge, Zetland, and Star of the East Lodge, the first Arabic-speaking lodge in Egypt. In an attempt to attract more members, the popular Lord Kitchener of Khartoum was appointed as a District Grand Master. This, however, was only to last a short time. Upon hearing the news that he was being transferred to South Africa to help with the Boer War, Sir Francis Reginald Wingate, Governor General of the Sudan, was appointed to replace him. A few years after being reconstituted as a separate jurisdiction, membership began to go up, albeit slowly, with more members from the Arab community joining. The year 1908 saw the first Arabic-speaking lodge founded in Khartoum. Lord Cromer, the Consul General in Egypt by now, and also a Freemason, helped to found the so-called Jadida Ummah Group, an intellectual circle for young Arabs, and several of its members became Freemasons through his influence. Prominent thinkers in Egypt, such as Jamal al-Afghani and Muhammad Abduh, were also members of the craft. Both of these men were interested in wresting Egypt from European control and in returning to a more traditional or originalist style of Islamic society, but one using a modern European lexicon influenced by the Enlightenment. Oddly, their ideas would eventually inspire some of the founders of the Salafist movement. Other Arab Masons were more conservative in their aims and formed the Watani, or National Party, which also grew out of Freemasonry. Essentially, Masonic lodges provided a common meeting ground for the elite of Egypt to discuss topics in secretive settings. Despite some brief successes, the craft fell into disarray in 1922 when Idris Bey Ragheb, the Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge of Egypt, was put on trial for Masonic offenses and then deposed. Idris Bey Ragheb had been the main proponent of Freemasonry in Egypt in the early 20th century, and his trial struck a hard blow to the craft in the country. His Masonic trial received some coverage in the local newspapers and negatively affected public opinion. Accused of allowing brethren to sell degrees, regalia, and titles for exorbitant prices, he agreed to step down at the end of 1922. When the Grand Lodge was opened in December of that year, he canceled the vote for him to resign and walked out of the meeting when there was dissent. However, he did not close the lodge and was thus voted out. Prince Muhammad Ali was then appointed as Grand Master, but resigned 4 years later due to another controversy. Much of this turmoil with Ragheb coincided with protests against British occupation in Egypt. The year 1922 saw the British Protectorate officially abolished and the Kingdom of Egypt proclaimed. However, extensive British involvement continued in the country. In 1924, Sir Lee Stack, Governor General of the Sudan and also a Freemason, and the District Grand Master of Egypt and the Sudan for the U.G.L.E. at the time, was assassinated in Cairo. The The public view of Freemasonry had begun to decline further, with Freemasonry becoming increasingly associated with Europeans, imperialism, and political intrigue. It was also around this time that the infamous anti-Semitic conspiracy work, Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, began to be circulated more widely. Masons were soon starting to be accused of being atheists and political agitators, and the British were lumped in with the French and Italians, despite the fact that English Masons were appalled at the anti-religious sentiments and political activities of some of the Continental Freemasons. The writings of Jewish Freemasons from the early 20th century were also taken out of context and interpreted in a sinister light to indicate Freemasonry as an organization whose intent was to control the economy. With the Zionist movement in full swing in British Palestine, Masonic lodges became associated in the minds of many with the Zionist B'nai B'rith lodges, which were based upon the Masonic organizational structure. By the late 1940s, the situation had deteriorated even further for the craft in Egypt. According to a memorandum dated June 25, 1948, a strict censorship on all U.G.L.E lodges was in force. No Masonic correspondence whatsoever was to be sent to England for fear of compromising the identity of members. Coinciding with the Suez Crisis in the fall of 1956, all the lodges of Egypt went dark, that is to say, they were closed indefinitely. President Nasser had decided to temporarily suspend all Masonic activities in the country. Pelusium Lodge number 3003 in Port Said was the last lodge to stay open in Egypt, probably due to the fact that it was in a smaller, albeit cosmopolitan, shipping center that is far removed from the capital of Cairo. However, by 1957, the U.G.L.E had erased Pelusium Lodge from its rolls. Syed Mohammed Salih el-Shangiti was appointed the District Grand Master of Egypt and the Sudan in 1960, just before a full ban on Masonry. He quickly moved the headquarters for the District Grand Lodge from Cairo to Khartoum due to the inhospitable political climate in Egypt, and a year later, the name was changed to be simply the District Grand Lodge of the Sudan. Freemasonry still tends to draw conspiracy theories, and many Egyptian Muslims have expressed wariness about the craft, often seeing it as incompatible with Islam. A fatwa that condemned Freemasonry was issued on July 15, 1978, by the Council of Senior Scholars at Al-Azhar University in Cairo, the leading Islamic university in the world. Though this fatwa was a bit contradictory, since it claimed that, while only atheists are promoted in the craft, it also purported that Masonry is a Jewish-controlled organization. The present political and religious climate in Egypt still remains hostile toward the craft, and there is currently no regular recognized Masonic body in the country. So, excuse me, I just need to take a quick sip of water. Having given an overview of the history of Freemasonry in Egypt, I would like now to turn to the politics and ethnic tensions in the craft in the country. Masonic lodges were very visible in the Egyptian community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Their temples were notable for both their unique architecture and the well-dressed members attending lodge in evening dress. The lodge had an appeal to the Egyptian male elite for several reasons. It was seen as a social club, but with an element of secrecy and exclusivity, something most likely appealing to the upper classes. The lodge also functioned as a meeting ground for people with different opinions and ideas. In addition, Freemasonry, which allows men from various professions to come together, was instrumental in advancing political careers. Lastly, the lodges were seen as a place to gain favor with the Europeans and attract royal patronage by showing allegiance to the monarch, seeing as Freemasonry stresses patriotism and loyalty to one's country. Indeed, with many prominent members, Masonry attracted royal patronage in Egypt. The Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Egypt was typically a member of the Egyptian royal family. Prince Muhammad Abduh Halim Pasha, Khedive Muhammad Ali's youngest son, was elected Grand Master of the Italian-dominated Grand Orient and appointed District Grand Master of the English District Grand Lodge in 1867. At the time, Prince Halim was still rankled by his nephew Ismail's appointment as Pasha of Egypt in 1863, and later as Khedive in 1867. The Egyptian law of succession stated that the eldest male relative was to succeed. However, Ismail contrived with the Ottoman Sultan to prevent Halim's succession as the eldest male of the family. The law was eventually changed in 1873 to that of primogeniture. Halim was then accused by Ismail, among others, of using the Masonic lodges as a power base to build up support for his claim to the throne. Ismail, who officially ascended the throne in 1867, had Halim exiled the following year. In his own absence, Halim appointed the British consul in Cairo, Reëstablishment, to act in his stead in the District Grand Lodge. U.G.L.E appointed him Deputy District Grand Master, a title that gave deference to the fact that Prince Halim was still acknowledged as the District Grand Master, with Borg as his deputy. Prince Halim vehemently denied any conspiracy, and even went so far as to write the Grand Master of England to profess his innocence, claiming that certain letters were planted upon his person to implicate him in a revolutionary plot. The Grand Master sent a reply stating that, while he could offer no political help, since that would be against the tenets of the craft, he could work to clear his name among his fellow Masons if he was truly innocent. The political and Masonic charges against him, however, were eventually accepted as fact. By 1878, the Grand Master of England had withdrawn Prince Halim's patent to function as District Grand Master of Egypt, and appointed Borg outright as District Grand Master pro tempore. With regard to the Continental lodges, Solutore Aventore Zola succeeded Halim as a Grand Master of the Grand Orient of Egypt. Tufik, the eldest son of Khedive Ismail, and later Khedive himself, was a Mason who had also established close ties with the craft. The Grand Secretary for Egypt, William Carbonaro, wrote to the U.G.L.E asking for him to be appointed District Grand Master to replace Halim. Carbonaro believed that there would be many benefits if Tufik were to be appointed. The Grand Master concurred, and Tufik was appointed District Grand Master of Egypt in the fall of 1879. By seeking royal patronage, British Masonry necessarily found itself involved in politics. Unlike the British monarchy, which by this time had become mostly ceremonial, the Egyptian monarchy was rife with plot and political intrigue. Whether or not the allegations against him were true, Prince Halim found himself at the center of this intrigue, as did the craft by association. This was made all the more difficult by the fact that Halim was well respected by other Masons, and, in addition to his position, his personal character seems to have played a part in having been elected District Grand Master. There may have also been a measure of sympathy toward him after he was removed by the Ottoman Sultan from the line of succession. Despite best intentions, by aligning the craft with the Egyptian royal family, Freemasonry unwittingly took on a political character in Egypt. This political character not only encompassed royal politics, but also ethno-political tensions among the Europeans, as well as between the Europeans and Arabs. What becomes apparent after looking through the surviving documents in the holding of the archives of the U.G.L.E is that the craft in Egypt became one of the stages on which the drama of European and Arab nationalism played itself out. During an address to the District Grand Lodge of Egypt, the Deputy District Grand Master and British Consul in Cairo, Raphael Borg, made mention of the political intrigues in the foreign lodges, but also stated that these had little effect on the lodges under English jurisdiction. He also expressed his interest in seeing more Arabs become Masons, but worried about them being persecuted by their countrymen, many of whom were suspicious of the craft. One objective of particular interest to him was the formation of an Arabic language lodge in the district. He wrote that, "The want of a lodge working in the Arabic tongue has been felt for a long time." In the 1860s, a composition of the English lodges was almost exclusively European, though efforts were being made across the craft to include more Arabs. Star of the East Lodge, number 1355, was founded in 1871 as the first Arabic language lodge in Egypt under the U.G.L.E. A few years later, in 1874, the Grand Orient of Egypt had declared Arabic as its official language, and Italian as only a semi-official language. Furthermore, members of the Egyptian royal family were being appointed as Grand Masters, and patronage from the royal family was frequently sought after. It was generally felt that Masonry could help improve the lot of the Egyptian people by advancing Western principles among their upper classes. Raphael Borg, at this time the British consul in Cairo, seems to have taken the so-called white man's burden to heart, writing that the Egyptians are rather primitive in their style, in their ideas, in their actions. They view it true through the eyes of the ruler for the time being, but they are more apt to be molded into proper form than many a European or Asiatic race. They look up to their sovereign as the unerring fountain of good, and owing to a remnant of religious fanaticism, they are somewhat prone to ascribe to Europeans any wrongs they may suffer from. In his personal correspondence, Borg also seemed to think that Roman Catholic missionaries from France and Italy were causing a great deal of damage and stunting the growth of the Egyptians, whereas Freemasonry, an overwhelmingly Protestant organization, could bring progress and the ideals of the Enlightenment to them. As Masonry began to expand, British Masons endeavored to cultivate Egyptian society's hereditary and intellectual elite through the craft. This program of influencing them extended to political thinkers who may not have been completely in line with British designs for the country. The English may have seen intellectuals like Muhammad Abduh, later rector of al-Azhar University, and his Jadida Ummah group as a way to bring progress in the form of liberal European ideas to Egypt by checking the powers of the Khedive. The views of Abduh's group, while initially hostile to British suzerainty, became more conciliatory over time as they saw some of the positive effects of the occupation. In contrast, political thinker Jamal al-Afghani was consistently opposed to British involvement in Egypt and was highly critical of Khedive Ismail as a collaborator. Afghani's primary purpose for joining the craft was a political one. In 1876, Raphael Borg convinced Afghani, by this time already a Mason, to join the Arabic-speaking lodge, Star of the East, now a part of the National Grand Lodge. Afghani soon became a member of multiple lodges and saw them as a means for effecting positive change in society, especially in light of Masonry's emphasis on the principles of freedom and equality. However, he would eventually be expelled from the fraternity for using the lodge as a political tool. Only a few years after entering the craft, Afghani was elected Worshipful Master of Star of the East Lodge for the year 1879, which means that he was elected to be head of the lodge and in complete charge of lodge affairs for his term. One of the first signs of his attempt to involve the craft in politics occurred in March of that year, when Borg saw him refuse to toast the Prince of Wales at a festive board, and overheard him saying in Arabic that all kings are tyrants. Afghani was also overheard discussing politics and some of his political plans with other Masons. Among the many accusations levied against him were that of using the lodge for political intrigue, involving lodge members in a riot, and utilizing the craft to make political threats against opponents. Afghani resigned his position as Worshipful Master after a few months on July 19, 1879. Later that year, Afghani helped instigate a rebellion, the so-called Arabi Revolt against Khedive Tewfiq, who had reneged on many of his promises that he had made to liberalize the country when he became Khedive. The fact that Egyptian Masons were already suspected of having had a hand in the Arabi Revolt and fomenting dissent among the Arab population did not help the situation. When it was discovered that Afghani had played a part in the rebellion, Tewfiq banished him from Egypt. After being exiled, he went to Paris and then to London in an attempt to get the French and British to disengage from his country. After the District Grand Lodge of Egypt was reestablished in 1899, now as the District Grand Lodge of Egypt and the Sudan, every effort was made to include Egyptians in the English lodges. Many lodges began sending correspondence asking whether fluency in English was required for membership. Khartoum Lodge even inquired about initiating Muslims by having them take their oath and obligation on the Holy Quran instead of the Holy Bible. Tied to the issue of religion is that of race and ethnicity. Though it is important to clarify terminology and how different groups perceive themselves and others. The issue of race and ethnicity in British Egypt is a fraught question due to the fact that the European concept of race is one that had not been clearly delineated or defined in Egyptian society until this point. Eve Trout-Powell, professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania, points out in her monograph, A Different Shade of Colonialism, that the concept of race was something that only became hardened with the European presence in Egypt and the Sudan. Prior to European presence in and control of the region, religion and ethnicity were the true primary identifiers among the local population. To describe the Egyptian adaptation of the concept of race, she brings in Mikhail Bakhtin's concept of heteroglassia to show how the Egyptians adopted the concept of race in a way that is slightly different from how Europeans use the term. That is to say, it became synonymous with skin color rather than with anthropological distinctions at the time. For example, Egypt's Arab intelligentsia tended to focus on racial differences in skin color and religious differences when it came to the Sudanese. Situated between so-called Black Africa and Europe, the Egyptians were acutely aware of their position. The British understanding of race in the context of Egypt was also not something entirely based upon anthropological theories at the time, seeing as it was tied to their mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, and to Protestant Christianity. British rule over the empire's various colonies and dependencies in Africa was so relatively short-lived that, according to Heather Sharkey, professor of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations at the University of Pennsylvania, one can arguably call this period a colonial moment. In this colonial moment, the British civilizing mission was of paramount importance in shaping views on race and ethnicity. But concomitant with this was a Protestant Christian evangelization mission and the attitude and beliefs of missionaries working in Egypt who engaged in a type of imperial Christianity and who, to some extent, saw their work as a fulfillment of the Crusades. Therefore, concepts of race were intertwined with Protestant Christianity and the greater emphasis that it gives to the Old Testament than Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox Christians. The story of Noah's sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, would have been a familiar one to most school children in England. These three Noahide sons are reputed to be the ancestors of the Semitic, African, and European peoples. Because of this, it is easy to see a distinction being made among the Semitic Arabs, the Hamitic Copts, and the Japhethitic Europeans, which also happen to follow religious lines, that is to say, Muslims, Eastern Coptic Christians, and Western Protestant and Roman Catholic Christians. On the whole, the Coptic Christians, as co-religionists, were seen in the most sympathetic light by the Europeans, and there was generally a sense of revulsion over the way non-Muslims were treated in the Islamic world. They were often perceived as living under a reign of terror due to the jizya, the Muslim tax on Jews and Christians, and the fact that they were not given certain rights within Egyptian society. There was also a latent, ever-present fear of violence and pogrom among the Coptic and Jewish population of the major cities. During the Arabi Rebellion in 1882, there was a general belief among the Egyptian Christians that, had not the British intervened, they would have been massacred and their property divided among the Muslim population, based upon rumors that had been heard from Muslim neighbors. It was this precarious situation, not only in Egypt, but throughout the Ottoman Empire, that was the impetus for European pressure on the Sublime Porte to enact a set of protections for minority religious populations, in particular the Eastern Christians. The Islahat Hata Humayun of 1856 was the firman, or edict, that officially gave these protections, and more. It also gave legal equality to all Ottoman citizens, including Christians, Jews, and other religious minorities. However, this was not well received by much of the Muslim population, especially in Egypt. The ensuing rise in status of the Eastern Christians due to the European presence was not looked kindly upon by many Muslims, with many envious of a rising Christian administrative class within the British colonial government. The colonial presence had now disrupted long-established stratifications among Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Egypt within the country's Islamic milieu. The social status quo had now been upset in the eyes of many, and the Europeans were to blame. It is perhaps for this reason that access to a liberal European education and to social organizations such as Freemasonry were part of the civilizing mission. The former taught the basis of and reasons for equality under British common law, and the latter enacted it in a social setting. Sir Reginald Wingate, as Governor General of the Sudan, promoted the construction of British schools for the local children. He wanted to disseminate the British public school code of honor among the children of the Sudan, and he saw strict discipline and activities such as sports and games as a remedy to the so-called slovenliness of the Sudanese home life. Indeed, secular schools, a la European Enlightenment ideas, were the primary means of westernization in the Middle East. They were also ways to counteract the influence of the madrasa, which was seen as a threat to not only the British, but also the Egyptian rulers. Khedive Pasha called the mosques and madrasas of Egypt hotbeds of fanaticism, and noted that the ulama, or religious leaders, and sheikhs were the ones most opposed to reforms, especially reforms giving equal treatment to non-Muslims. The British secular schools were meant to curb this fanaticism and steer the future generations of Egyptians toward a set of ideals more in line with those of Britain, including the ideal of equality before the law. The lodge was another space where the idea of placing all men on equal footing was reinforced. Freemasonry posits itself as an ecumenical endeavor embracing men of all races and creeds, in spite of not always having lived up to that ideal. Despite the fact that lodges in Egypt were formed primarily for Englishmen of the colonial administration living in the country, there was an attempt to introduce Freemasonry to the local Egyptian population for the purpose of teaching its moral values and having it contribute to the local community. Unfortunately, these ideals have become bogged down in ethnic tensions and what was perceived by the British as a lack of understanding of the purpose of Masonry among the local Arab population. Of the various lodges founded in Egypt under the English Constitution, Lodge La Concordia, number 1266, presents us with an interesting case study of a lodge founded to meet the needs of the local multi-ethnic community in Egypt. La Concordia was founded as a lodge working its business and ritual in the Italian language under the jurisdiction of the U.G.L.E, with a mixed ethnic membership. The lodge was warranted on June 5, 1868, for the purpose of healing a number of persons who had been initiated in clandestine and irregular lodges. La Concordia had Christian, Jewish, and Muslim members, and eventually adopted Arabic as one of its languages. French was used as a language of correspondence. La Concordia was a truly cosmopolitan lodge, functioning in the late 19th century. This was not to remain the case, however. Reporting on the condition of La Concordia Lodge in 1890, Raphael Borg, now a past Grand Master of the National Grand Lodge of Egypt, wrote that instead of assimilating in the true principles of Freemasonry, races and creeds, this lodge has brought about a perversion of any innate or acquired sentiment of mutual toleration, and has embittered the feelings of difference of creeds, especially Christians, toward Hebrews and Muslims. In the span of 22 years, the lodge had managed to go from concord and harmony among its diverse brethren to a state of chaos, intrigue, and squabbling. Much of this had to do with mounting tension in the lodge between the Italians, led by Agostino Raffaelli, and the Egyptian Arabs and Jews, led by Muhammad Abduh and Munib Abbas. In a letter to the Grand Secretary of England, dated May 24, 1888, Brother Raffaelli, the worshipful master of the lodge at this time, wrote, "Now it is evident that Brother U.G.L.E will maintain several of his natives in a continual rebellion, nor could we come to an arrangement with them anymore." Throughout the letter, Raffaelli continually refers to the Egyptians in a deprecatory manner and makes frequent mention of various conspiracies fomented by them, including an attempt to blackball all new members. Additionally, he lists several Egyptian members who he has suspended from the lodge for various reasons. This list of suspicions is actually quite extensive, comprising over a dozen brethren. This list of suspensions is actually quite extensive, comprising over a dozen brethren. Finally, he complains about the use of Arabic for conferring degrees upon Arabic-speaking members, and insists that the lodge only use Italian, under which it originally worked. The Egyptian brethren eventually responded with a letter dated September 28, 1888, in which several European members of La Concordia made formal charges against the worshipful master. These accusations ran along the lines of financial mismanagement and suspending members who disagree with him on the grounds of alleged non-payment of dues. This would be followed by a rebuttal in December, with Raffaelli making similar accusations of financial impropriety by the lodge treasurer Munib Abbas, as well as of several members who sided with the treasurer against him. Raphael Borg's assessment of the situation is that the Worshipful Masters Party was in the wrong, and that he was completely on the side of the Arab Brethren. His final recommendation, however, is that the Arab Brethren be moved to the Arabic Language Lodge, Star of the East, and that La Concordia be dissolved. The lodge was erased in June of 1890. For Borg, the Italians were causing the trouble and not being sympathetic toward brethren from the local Egyptian population. The theme of the troublesome foreigner is a frequent one in the correspondence located in the archives of the U.G.L.E. related to Freemasonry in Egypt. The French, Italians, and Greeks were often seen as meddlesome and inclined to stirring up political turmoil in the country, though the Greeks much less so compared to the other two groups. Indeed, one of the primary objectives of Lord Cromer, Consul General of Egypt from 1883 to 1907, was to curtail the power of foreigners in Egypt to secure British control, as well as to stop local Europeans from harming Egyptians by fomenting political extremism through the spread of radical ideas coming from Europe, such as communism and anarchism. These local Europeans in Egypt were seen as Orientalized Europeans by the British, and they had adopted all of the debauchery and decadence of the so-called Orientals, and thus had descended into a state of suspect morals. According to Lord Cromer, they were not Europeans of a good type. By 1886, all foreigners became subject to a house tax for the purpose of curtailing continental European immigration, business, and influence. In 1891, a professional tax was added to this, with Greeks accounting for half of the foreign population in Cairo and a larger percentage in Alexandria. After an overwhelming outcry from the European expat population, the professional tax alone was rescinded the following year, but the house tax still marked the loss of privileges for all foreigners except the British. The irony of this is that many of the British readily criticized the restrictions and taxes placed upon Egyptian Christians and Jews under Muslim rule, while instituting the same conditions for continental Europeans living in the country. The tax had the effect of creating a heavily stratified British Egypt along ethnic, national, and religious lines that became the status quo for much of the British occupation. Protestant British, Coptic Christians, Arab Muslims, Greek Orthodox Christians, and French and Italian, often nominal, Roman Catholics became stratified and locked into the bubble of their local communities. Though the British may have advocated legal equality, they seem to eschew social equality as something problematic, seeing as they were not able to, nor did they want to, fully understand the other cultures with which they were dealing. Though these attitudes seem to change somewhat over time as a British and European presence in Egypt became entrenched, with the district Grand Master praising the attitude of many Egyptians and Sudanese toward Freemasonry and the realization of its humanitarian potential in the 1930s. Perusing the correspondence and the records from the District Grand Lodge of Egypt and the Sudan, one could come to the conclusion that tension and misunderstandings between the various ethnic groups in the country occurred in a wide variety of combinations. Following the Second World War, Egypt began to see a rise in student demonstrations, turning into riots in Alexandria and Cairo, protesting the British occupation. Correspondence from the U.G.L.E. archives makes mention of this disrupting of daily life in the cities. These riots would eventually culminate in the 1952 coup d'etat that overthrew the monarchy and ousted the British presence. The last days of Freemasonry in Egypt seemed filled with uncertainty and trepidation. It had failed to become a significantly influential cultural force and to attract sufficient numbers of Egyptian members for it to be seen as a truly equitable fraternal organization. Each of the lodges was suffering for want of membership. Many members had removed back to the UK or had died, and new members of the local Egyptian population came halting forth. In a letter dated November 9, 1949, from the Secretary of Serapion Lodge number 5312 to Frederick David Stevenson Drain, then District Grand Secretary, he mentions that Serapion Lodge in Ismailia is closing due to a lack of officers, caused by the political change in Egypt. The members of the local Egyptian population were afraid to attend. The District Grand Lodge did not meet as a whole in November of 1951 due to political disturbances, and the subordinate lodge meetings were urged to be as unostentatious as possible. No music was to be played in or out of the temple. Buildings would close by 8 p.m. Also, meetings were discouraged when there was danger. Stevenson Drain, now the Assistant District Grand Master, left Egypt for England to discuss the situation with the Grand Secretary of the U.G.L.E, who stated that he wanted to see the lodges carry on in the hope that one day local conditions might improve and more Britishers become available for membership to help bolster the craft. Because of the stigma now attached to Freemasonry as a tool of the colonizer, the focus had moved from local Egyptians to the British to help sustain the lodges of Egypt. Lodges in the Sudan, however, carried on as normal. The District Grand Master also believed that lodges could make a contribution toward peace after the political upheaval of 1951 to 1952. In 1953, an address delivered by Brother Drain mentions a decrease in new members and difficulty in filling positions in the lodges due to the shortage of experienced brethren. He therefore suggested consolidation of several subordinate lodges into fewer. The death of Sir Reginald Wingate the previous year was also mentioned. His death is almost like a portent of what awaited the craft in a few years. Despite Drain's optimism, in 1952, Alexandria Lodge, at one time one of the largest in Egypt, went dark after 32 years of existence. Drain's optimism was perhaps sustained by the fact that the Sudanese lodges were doing well at this time. In 1954, there was growing anxiety about the lodges in Egypt and being able to keep them open. A sudden slew of retirements and members returning to England, with fewer members joining, began to seriously exacerbate concerns. Instances of members visiting other lodges to swell numbers and fill officer roles for the ritual were frequent. Drain noted that these are difficult times for our lodges. It is interesting to note that as of 1955, there were only 2 Arab district grand officers, Riyad Mansour, the district grand steward, and Sadiq Shaki, the associate director of ceremonies, both of whom were from Lodge Mahfal al-Ittihad in Khartoum. At this time, Freemasonry in the Sudan was healthy and thriving. Members of Lodge Mahfal al-Ittihad were looking to form a second Arabic-speaking lodge to replace Atbara Lodge, which had closed. Mahfal al-Ittihad was strong in members and influence. By November of 1955, membership in most lodges in Egypt continues to drop, and in some cases, finances are reaching a dangerously low level. The year 1956 saw many Masons in the Suez Canal zone, and they had petitioned for a lodge there. This was perhaps the last bright moment for Freemasonry in Egypt. In April of 1956, the Egyptian authorities temporarily suspended all Masonic activity in Cairo. Enforcement of Law Number 61 began to take place, which required the District Grand Lodge to register with the Ministry of Social Affairs. By June, British forces had completely withdrawn from the country. The history of the craft in Egypt from this point is not well known due to U.G.L.E sealing of records past a certain date to protect the privacy of living members and their immediate relatives. What is known is that President Nasser finally banned Egypt in the country in 1964, a surprising 8 years after the British withdrawal. By the time Nasser issues a ban on the organization, it had become almost non-existent in Egypt. In trying to follow the European example of allying itself with the ruling government, it set itself up for involvement in local politics, which stunted its growth and contributed to its decline. The Khedivas were involved in several complicated games of political chess with the Ottomans, British, French, and Italians, and these competing ethno-political interests naturally spilled over into the lodge. Ethnic strife also kept Freemasonry from becoming unified and unifying social force. Disagreements about things like language and jurisdiction kept the brethren at almost constant odds. When President Nasser issued his edict banning Freemasonry in Egypt, he delivered the coup de grace to the withered Masonic body in the land of the pharaohs. Thank you for listening. Now, very quickly, I have a little addendum to the end. Since I'm also an art historian, in addition to being trained as a historian in my undergraduate and master's degrees, I'd like to end by briefly showing you a few of the lodge seals from the former District Grand Lodge of Egypt and the Sudan. I was very much impressed with their creativity. So I'm just going to show you 4 quick representative examples. The first one here is the seal for Khartoum Lodge number 2877. And this was founded in the Sudan under the auspices of Sir Reginald Wingate. Now, if you look at this, what's kind of interesting is that you see at the top, I don't know if the mouse will work here, you can see the word win, and then beneath it is a gate, sort of giving reference to his name, Wingate. Of course, it says here the lodge number and under the English Constitution. Here we have Pelusium Lodge number 3003. This was named after the ancient Greek city of Pelusium on the Nile Delta, the location of Port Said in modern times. Notice the Greek urn above a Greek meander pattern named after the Meander River. However, this meander pattern here mimics the shape of the water passages of Port Said. Here we have Atbara Lodge number 3407. Formerly working in the Sudan, the lodge was named after the city whose Arabic spelling appears in the center, along with the date of the warrant, 1910 right here. And then lastly, we have Alexandria Lodge number 4184. I like all these English high numbers for lodges. The seal of Alexandria Lodge contains, of course, an image of the pharaohs or lighthouse of Alexandria, one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Right. And I guess that's it. Thank you for joining today. Take care.